Hello, I'm Alec Torelli. Welcome back to the Hand of the Day. Apologize for the gym clothes, but I am on my way to a workout. Got some caffeine, feeling inspired to do a quick video. So, Mr. Kenneth Key, today's question comes from you, and I'm here to make you a video. All right, so he goes on to say, I really seem to have a bit of a problem playing against very good, loose, aggressive opponents. Those are generally the toughest people to play against. They put you in sticky situations. They're frustrating to play against. You never really know when they're going to pull that crazy check raise. You're kind of always on edge against them. You're kind of scared to be in the pot. I get it. He says, it's hard to have a hand all the time, and I feel like they take advantage of my weakness. For example, I find myself giving up in situations where I am the aggressor. I miss the flop completely, and I don't know what to do. I feel like they're going to play back at me. It's especially hard when I'm deep stacked. Any advice would really help. So, Kenneth, the simple answer, and notice I'm not even going to go into the example of what the hand is, because we're here to talk about this on a macro level, meaning how to apply this situation to your overall game, to your overall strategy, so it can help you against all types of opponents. Because to talk about one specific hand is a little impractical. It only helps you in that one situation, but what do you do in all the situations? So the simple answer here, and again, you're going to apply this macroeconomically to all the situations, is just not to fight back. Now, I know I'm trivializing this a little bit, but just wait until you have a hand. Sometimes you may feel like checking behind is being too passive, or that giving up pots is wrong because you've been taught, and generally so, that aggression is winning poker. And most of the time it is. But remember, we are trying to exploit our opponents here. And playing exploitative poker is about adjusting, you hear that word all the time in poker, is adjusting to your opponents. And so sometimes that means when they're being overly aggressive, how do I adjust to over-aggression? Well, I resist. I have less aggression. So it's letting them be too aggressive, understanding their tendencies, and then waiting for a big hand. Now, you may say, well, if I wait for a big hand, they're going to know. This is the fear that we internalize a lot of times. Like, I need to be a little creative and crazy because otherwise they're just going to know I have it. Now, in live poker, especially if you've built up a certain image of being loose or a little crazy, it's time to get paid off on that image you've built up. And it's really hard for someone to determine when you're playing tight and when you're not, because you don't have a huge sample in live poker of that many hands you play. Online, of course, it's a little different. But either way, when you're trying to exploit your opponents, until they give you a sign that they've changed their opinion of you or their style of play against you, you don't have any reason to think that this loose, aggressive, maybe hyperactive opponent is now going to somehow shut down when you start betting. Because you've been betting without a hand and it hasn't been working. So if you bet with a hand, he's still going to play back at you because that has his style against you. And maybe he plays that style against you because it works. Maybe it's time to start thinking about, why is he playing that style against me? What does him playing that style against me tell me about myself? Not what does it tell me about him? Because maybe he figured out that that's the best way to play against me, Mr. Kenneth, because I'm betting the flop too often with not good hands. I'm raising too often pre-flop. I'm folding too often when he check raises me. Well, shit. If it was me, I would do the same thing as him. Maybe. Okay? Now, maybe this is telling you something about you. So by internalizing what you're seeing, you can use that as a reflection to understand how you can help your own game by maybe seeing some of your weaknesses through the actions of the other opponent. Because if it's working against you, it means that you have a weakness that perhaps need to be combated. So that's something else to take away from this as well. But this is the simple answer. What are you going to say? Is he going to watch my video and say, well, it told me just to check behind and against an opponent that plays too many hands? Shit, I knew that. That's the simple answer, right? So I don't want to only over-trivialize this and make it seem like, some super obvious decision. If it was that obvious, everybody would be doing it. You would be adjusting. So the key is how to take this to your next opponent, or what types of opponents do you implement this strategy on, and what other types of opponents do you not implement this strategy on? What types of opponents do you take advantage of, and what others do you kind of pull back the reins a little bit? So here's my simple strategy. I like to make things in common vernacular so that everybody can understand. about when to implement this idea of pulling back the reins and when to really push on an opponent and take advantage of them. Okay, so the two things to consider, the two variables, the big ones. There's more, of course. Stack size is important. Past history is important. Your image is important. Everything's important. But the two real things to consider are the difference in skill between me and my opponents, or you and your opponents, because it's about you, and your position. Okay, so versus weaker opponents, meaning you're better than them, you want to be taking advantage of them. You can afford to be a little more creative, a little more aggressive, to put yourself in what would otherwise be a compromising situation, because they're not going to figure out that you maybe are imbalanced, meaning that you bet too many flops. They're just going to fold too often. Or you're going to bet the flop when you miss completely. They're going to call you, but you don't care because you know they're going to fold the turn, right? And you take advantage of those opponents. So you're being imbalanced yourself. You could be exploited, but they're not exploiting you, so you're going to keep doing it, right? So the second thing to consider, besides the weak opponent, is the position. Now, the more you are in position, the more hands you can afford to play against them. So if the opponent is weaker, you can play more hands against them in position and more hands out of position, okay? But when you're out of position, of course, you need to be tighter. But depending on the difference in skill between you and them, the more hands you could justify playing both in position and out of position. And that's really, really important, because it leads us to our second topic of players, which are the good players, the great players, the excellent players. Against them, you have to play an extremely foundational poker game. And if they are better than you, your goal might not be to exploit them, because it's really hard to exploit players that are better than you. And this gentleman in the big blind that's calling you too often, the loose aggressive opponent that seems to have you figured out. We've all played against people that seem to be just have you figured out, and it's a frustrating feeling. They might be better than us. That's possible. If they are, what do we do? Okay, so against them, we want to play a very solid foundational poker game. Again, remember, the amount of hands we can play determines on the position and the difference in skill between us and our opponents. So if they're better than us, or as good as us, or near our ability level, we don't want to play pretty much any hands out of position except really, really strong ones, because even weaker players are going to play better than us in position because they have more information. But better players are going to play better than us normally, but in position they're going to play even better. So we cannot afford to let them play better than us by playing out of position. We're just killing ourselves there. But even in position, we want to be really, really strong with the hands we enter the pot with. Now, entering the pot is the foundation of poker, but what do you do post-flop? What do you do in other situations, right? You want to play a really solid foundational approach to this player. So that means that no matter what decision you make, your opponent really can't exploit you too much, because you're playing a really balanced, a really solid, a really foundational, strong, almost like ABC approach to them. And this, some people call this a game theory approach, more specifically and more complex. It's known as game theory. And what that means is you're playing in such a way that no matter what your opponent does, what course of action they take, they will not be able to exploit you. You're essentially being like a wall. So you don't really care whether they raise you or fold or call, because you're playing in such a way that your hands that you have are so balanced that it's unlikely that they can't really take advantage of you, because half the time you're going to be bluffing, half the time you're not going to be. So it's really 50-50, and you're really balancing your hands, you're balancing your range, you're approaching that person, that opponent, with a very foundational approach that is just strong and solid. And there's really not much room for weakness. So you're not putting yourself in a compromising situation by betting the flop with a marginal hand, by raising with a spot where you're going to have to raise and then bet the turn and bet the river to get them to fold. You're just playing an ABC approach. Now, this doesn't mean that they're going to be able to exploit you because you're too straightforward. Because by being straightforward, you're playing really solid. And so you're only entering the pot with really solid hands, and there's not really any room to exploit you. If someone only plays the top 10% of hands, even if you know they have the top 10% of hands, there's not really a strategy that beats that. That's a winning strategy in poker. It might not win the most money. It might not exploit the maximum amount of money, but it's a winning strategy in poker. You pretty much can't lose if you're playing those hands relatively well post-flop. Okay? So that's kind of the approach you want to take. The more and more restrictive you want to be against the better and better and better opponents. And so you kind of have to be prepared to adjust dramatically your approach to a hand when different people are in the pot. So now this means, in practicality, you might not raise the big blind of an opponent without a really strong hand if that opponent is really good. You might not even enter the pot. Or if a really good player raises, you might make a different decision with the same hand as you would if a weaker player raised. So if the two different players raise, even if you have the same hand, you might make one decision versus a good player, which is to stay out of the way or fold or just call. And against a weak player, you might call or re-raise or isolate them to play a bigger pot because you're confident that you're going to make better decisions later on. And this is the philosophy to which you need to apply when you're playing against good players and weaker players. So, Kenneth, I hope that helped, and I hope you take this to be on a broad level to understanding the type of player, first acknowledging within yourself what that player could be teaching you about yourself, what his tendencies teach you about your own game, so you could work on that, and also how to play against different types of players and when to use different strategies. So I hope that helped. Definitely send me more of your guys' questions. Loving doing these videos. This is really, really fun, and hope to answer more, help you guys out. So anything you guys have, shoot me over. Strategy questions, lifestyle, health, whatever it is. Kenneth, I just acted. Now it's on you. Peace.